Russia is continuing its move toward Kiev, apparently. There's a big convoy that's been spotted by satellites. So everyone knows about that. Everyone's seeing that in the news. In terms of Iran, another deadly, dangerous regime, we know that the nuclear deal is very close to being sealed. Chinese Communist Party, they're not backing down in terms of not condemning Russia, although there's a lot of international pressure on them to do that. And then we have North Korea, has been reported by South Korea to be doing missile testing just recently.
That's right, Brendan. What you've just described is actually an entire block of nations that are rising to oppose post-Cold War American leadership.
This is one mob of actors we don't want to see banding together. This would have serious implications. And how is this actually happening?
Yeah, the issue is this is not just a threat to the United States, but it's a threat to the United States allies and partners around the world, as well as global stability generally. So let's dig into the details right now.
I'm Brendan Fallon.
And I'm Lee Smith.
And we're over the target. So Lee, on this topic, I know that in January, there was a trilateral naval exercise that included the Chinese Communist Party, included Russia and Iran. Are there other indicators that you see that these actors are banding together?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that's gone unremarked in lots of the press commentary about what's happening right now in Ukraine is the fact that at the same time, the Biden administration appears to be digging in on Vladimir Putin. There's another move going on as well. And what that other move is that the United States is now negotiating with Russia over the Iranian nuclear program, right? The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. The first time the United States was negotiating over the deal, it dealt directly with Iranian negotiators, but right now it's dealing with the Russians. And again, this is something that people do not understand it's happening. When you see all the big coverage about how the US and the West is taking a strong position against Vladimir Putin, couldn't be further from the case, right? What's really happening is that if this deal goes through, the Russians will benefit from the deal, from the Iranian nuclear deal, because Iran is one of Russia's allies, as well as China on the other hand. What we're looking at, Brendan, it's fascinating to see, we're looking at a reversal of what started in the 1970s with something you and I have spoken about quite a bit. We saw the 50th anniversary just last month of Richard M. Nixon and Henry Kissinger's trip to China. So what we're seeing right now is basically turning that strategic concept on its head.
I know that Kissinger and Nixon's trip to China in 1972, it was kind of a symbolic gesture. It was this is what we look back now in history and think this is where this all started. The problems, the threat the Chinese Communist Party represents to the Western world. This is very much the milestone starting point of this all happening, right?
Exactly. And no one knew, of course, but this is how history works. You have one plan and something else happens, a whole bunch of different cascade effects, you see. What happened was in 1972, Nixon and Kissinger believed that opening relations with Beijing would help further drive a wedge between Beijing and Moscow, the center, the capital of the much more powerful communist regime at that point, the Soviet Union. And in effect, American policymakers deserve some credit, namely Nixon and Kissinger, because in fact, within 2 decades, in 1989 through 1991, we started to see the deterioration of the Soviet Union. So that in itself was successful. What we also started to see was throughout the 90s, as you and I have discussed many times, throughout the 90s, we started to see American policymakers strengthen and enhance the prestige of the Chinese Communist Party. So again, what started as a geopolitical instrument to weaken the Soviet Union turned into, over time, something that helped strengthen the Chinese Communist Party. So where are we now? Again, if Moscow was weakened 50 years ago, we now see that Beijing is the senior partner in an alliance between China and Russia, which is a profound turnaround. And one of the most profound turnarounds of it is that while this geopolitical instrument was used to benefit American interests, we now see the United States not benefiting, but we see the United States on its back heels because this is a national security threat, this growing bloc with Russia, China, and the Iranians.
I guess one question I have, I mean, we know that Russia, from what I understand, part of the reason that it's gone into Ukraine is almost like it's suffering from insecurity to some degree. Like it looks at NATO could potentially move into Ukraine and it becomes more of a threat to Russia. So it has to act now because its nuclear arsenal is aging. If it doesn't act now, it may not be able to do anything about it in the future. If we look at the situation with the Chinese Communist Party, some commentators are saying because of Russia going into Ukraine, China's design and the kind of backlash that the international community has shown to that, it lessens China's chances of being able to go after Taiwan now. So I guess why is the idea of this mob coming together such a crisis? Why is it such a threat?
Interesting. You know, I don't think that this will discourage. I mean, yes, the world community has risen to say this is bad, what Vladimir Putin is doing in Ukraine. Nonetheless, Vladimir Putin has continued to press throughout Ukraine, and I don't think we're going to see an end to this conflict without Vladimir Putin getting his way. That's my sense right now, and that's what the layout looks. So I imagine that leadership in Beijing is looking on, and they're saying, yes, this is one of the reasons we signed off, and this is one of the reasons that we're partnered with the Russians right now, because they play a very strong hand. So I don't think that the CCP is at all reconsidering its designs on Taiwan because of what's unfolding in Ukraine. And in fact, I would say it's not just what's happening in Kiev that is emboldening the CCP, but it's important to remember the CCP also moved on Hong Kong, right? Without the West being able to do anything. The responses were clearly ineffective. What else? Something that we've talked about at great length. But I mean, the CCP is also responsible for what effectively became a bioweapon release, right? After they lied about it, they lied about the nature, the origins of COVID. They lied about how it was transmitted. So at a certain point, it really did become an instrument of biowarfare. They lied about that. They've never been held accountable for the amount of death and destruction they caused around the world. So putting all these things together, I think it's important to look what happened before Putin moved on Ukraine. And again, to consider this in terms of a bloc, right? These actors aren't moving on their own. They're not always moving, holding each other's hands. But as we just talked about with the Russians negotiating on behalf of Iran, you can see that they are deeply networked, right? So the interest of one will help promote the interest of another. So Beijing leadership has definitely been looking at what's going on in Kiev and looking at the world's response, which appears certainly at present to be pretty impotent.
And speaking of impotence, I see that coming through a lot in this response to Russia at the moment, because there's been such a strong backlash, but there's a clear inconsistency here to the way that the world has responded to what the CCP has done to the violations of the Chinese Communist Party. And one example is Hong Kong, as you were saying. The Chinese Communist Party accepted that Hong Kong would there'd be a maintenance of one country's two systems.
Right. So it tells you what happens. It shows when you believe that these different parties are going to abide by different agreements. And of course, this is one of the things that we're looking at right now when we hear that Vladimir Putin says all he wants from Kiev is to promise to be neutral. Will the Russians abide by that, right? The Russians clearly did not abide by the Budapest memorandum, right? Which was that if Ukraine got rid of its nuclear weapons, Russia, the United States, and other Western powers would come to its aid in case of there was hostile movement against it, right? So, but in this case, it's not just Russia that didn't abide by the Budapest Memorandum, the Budapest Agreement, right? It was also the United States. Ukraine got rid of its weapons, foolishly, I believe. And what happened? Moscow eventually moved on Ukraine, and the United States is not able to do anything. So this is one of the other issues, is that this bloc, the rise of this oppositional bloc, resistance bloc, whatever we want to call it, is raising very vital questions for Western powers insofar as what do agreements mean going forward, right? How much will these be replaced by sheer force, right? If we look right now, one of the important things that Putin says he's moving against is NATO. How effective is NATO? right? If Ukraine wanted to get into NATO, and the Biden administration and other American presidential administrations have been promising or hinting at accession to NATO for Ukraine, what has NATO been able to do, right? Again, I think it was a very bad idea to try to plant the NATO flag on Russia's borders in Ukraine. But we have to ask ourselves, I mean, what is NATO actually able to do in these situations in opposition to a powerful oppositional bloc?
And in terms of these countries not honoring their agreements, like the Chinese Communist Party with Hong Kong, with Russia, with the Budapest Memorandum, I wonder, is it really such a threat? Because these countries, this level of treachery that they display, how well are they actually going to be able to cooperate with each other? Because it's their nature to backstab and to deceive. If you just look at what the
right, yeah. No, it's a very good point. I mean, we saw throughout the 20th century what it meant when you had extremely dangerous regimes in cooperation with each other. Whether we're talking about the Nazis and Imperial Japan and fascist Italy, whether we were talking about the Cold War and the brief cooperation between the Chinese Communist Party and then the Soviet Communist Party, right? So there are always rivalries. There are always rivalries that come about. So I think you make a very good point. No, I don't necessarily think that these are alliances that are bred in the blood, and we as authoritarian regimes, we must all stick together against the democracies. Yeah, no, I think it's extremely opportunistic, but I think they look around and they see that this current alliance provides many important different opportunities to make money off of each other and to pose a genuine threat to the United States and other Western powers. So what are the different ways that they can advance their own interests? Look, something else that, when we're talking about imperial powers, I mean, the Belt and Road Initiative represents a tremendous imperial enterprise for the Chinese Communist Party. Then we look at the different places around the world, certainly in the Middle East and Syria, where Russia has a hand. Then we look at Iran, right? Iran is also in Syria. So they're moving to the Eastern Mediterranean. So I think if you were to take out a map, right, where all geopolitics starts, if you were to take out a map and look at everything from the Belt and Road Initiative to China's work in places like Latin America, to Iran's work in Latin America, to what the Russians are doing, not just in Eastern and Central Europe, but also Europe, right, through Germany, through the different pipelines. And then in the Middle East, it's astonishing, right? It's an important thing that we all look at the map and see exactly where this rising bloc is contesting the Western powers, what we call the community of democracies. It's time that we recognize what's going on.
Yeah, it's a very frightening game of risk that's playing out before us, I'd say.
Yeah, very good way to put it. Yeah.
It kind of begs the question: what are Western democracies going to do about this? What is the U.S. going to do about it? And currently, it doesn't look that favorable. I was just we were talking about contradictions earlier and impotence on part of the U.S. and the West to act. Recently, this was what Lavrov, the foreign minister from Russia, came back with when they were negotiating the Iran deal. I'll quote: "This is what Lavrov has asked for. A written guarantee from the U.S. that the current sanctions process launched by the U.S. will not harm our right, Russia's right, to trade and economic and investment cooperation and military technical cooperation with Iran."
Yeah, so I mean, the Biden administration is going to have to make a choice, but of course the Biden administration and the Obama administration before it, which pushed for the Iran nuclear deal, put itself in an extremely vulnerable position, right? The vulnerable position was simply this: if you want to give a nuclear weapons program, legalize or legitimize the nuclear weapons program of a terror state that has allies like Moscow, like Beijing, you're putting yourself in a dangerous position. The Lavrov statement that you read off is really central and really important, and that's what people should be understanding and focusing on here. Again, all of this stuff going on in Ukraine. Ooh, what is Joe Biden saying about Ukraine and Putin moving on Ukraine? there's something else going on, and that's here, right? It's about the nuclear deal. In fact, I think we're going to see more and more evidence coming around that the reason that the Russians decided to move on Ukraine at the present moment, right, and they hadn't done it before, and they didn't wait, was because they understood that they had a tremendous amount of leverage on the United States and the other Western powers that were interested in signing or interested in making the nuclear deal with Iran, namely Germany, France, and the United Kingdom. Right, they were going to have leverage on them because this is especially for the Biden administration. The Iran nuclear deal is so important to them. So what did the Russians do? The Russians understood, of course, that the United States their immediate response was not going to be kinetic action or an actual shooting war, but it was going to be to go for sanctions. And then, of course, here comes Mr. Lavrov, an extremely gifted diplomat, and he says, if you're going to sanction us, then we're going to hold off on the nuclear deal. How's that? Since we've been negotiating with the Iranians, we have their vote here, so maybe we'll hold off. And now we'll see the Biden administration scattering because for various reasons, this is a high priority for what I refer to as the Obama-Biden faction.
A very complex and intriguing web of dynamics underlying everything here, Lee, as is often the case. Maybe I'm not sure if I have this right or not, but again, this kind of comes back to, I kind of wonder where it's going to lead with these particular actors cooperating with one another. There's obviously a very clear danger here, but it's also intriguing about how they could potentially and try and get the upper hand over the other. I mean, what's happening with the nuclear deal. To some extent, has Russia hamstrung Iran's progress towards getting this deal that it clearly wants very much by setting this condition?
Well, it's interesting. We heard some noise out of the Iranian Foreign Ministry over the weekend after Lavrov's statement, and they said, "Wait a minute. We're not sure that we agree with this." But again, a lot of the messaging is coordinated, just as we've seen, right, in the conflict in Ukraine. There is the fog of war, and these are propaganda machines. This is what happens during war. Propaganda is disseminated. You don't know exactly what to believe. This is an important diplomatic gambit for the Russians and the Iranians. We don't know how much of this messaging has been coordinated. We don't know how much of it is exactly true. But both Moscow and Tehran understand how eager the Biden administration is to have the deal. Right, because the Iranians have been saying since Biden took office, like, maybe we want the nuclear deal. We don't know. We're a little upset. You're going to have to make certain guarantees because Trump got out of the nuclear deal, and how do we know this isn't going to happen again? So again, they had the Biden administration playing the role of supplicant to a terror regime in Tehran. So you're exactly right. I totally agree with you that these are dangerous characters. And how do we know for how much longer they will be able to get along and as a unified bloc? But I think it's probably not correct to see them as a monolith like that. I think the way to understand it again is an organization that has come together for opportunistic reasons, right, that shares certain interests. And one of the most important interests, the central interest they appear to share, is they are in opposition to the United States and the U.S.-led order, certainly of the West, certainly of Europe, certainly of most of Asia, of Latin America, of Africa, certainly Australia. I mean, the U.S.-led order, right, of the post-Cold War period. These actors are all in opposition to them. And that's why they're known as, when we call powers like this adventurous, revisionist powers, because they're trying to revise the order of the world that we now see, which is the post-Cold War American order, which is, this is one of the things that we're seeing in Ukraine. It is under serious attack, right?
Definitely. And to me, at least, I think to many people, this is quite an unexpected development that these particular powers at the same time seem to be rearing up and have this much influence in the world. And so it kind of prompts the question, how did this come about? When did this start? And what has happened along the way that has led to this current phenomenon?
Right. We talk about Marxism, and Marxism is built on I hope I'm not getting too far out there, but Marxism is built on the idea of the dialectic, right? And what I'll just say in short is that history never moves in a straight line, as we started in our opening. History never moves in a straight line, right? It's the line about the best laid plans of mice and men, right? Things change. And this is one of the things that changed right here. With the United States helping set in motion with Nixon and Kissinger in 1972, helping to set in motion this process, a geopolitical maneuver to benefit the United States. What we now see 50 years on is both in American relations with Iran, with the Chinese Communist Party, as well as with Russia. The profound irony is that the United States has helped usher in this new rival bloc.
This almost seems like another episode in itself, Lee, to go into the depths of this.
Indeed, it merits a long discussion to understand the different details, how we helped empower the Chinese Communist Party, how we helped make them rich and impoverish the United States at the same time, the different benefits that Moscow has reaped from that, and certainly how the United States, how Washington policymakers on the left and right have helped advance the interests of the Islamic Republic of Iran. This is one of the profound tragedies of history, the role that the United States has played in building a bloc in opposition to American power, to Western power, to the strength, to the vitality and integrity of our democracies.
This sounds like a crucial line of inquiry, and as always, understanding this history is so critical to being able to interpret the kind of messaging that we're getting from the media and from politicians that we know isn't necessarily on the level.
It's absolutely vital, and this is one of the tasks that you and I have set ourselves, to provide accurate information for people, for Americans and others, to be able to make important decisions about their lives and about our future. And we're going to go into that in greater detail in our next episode.
I'm Brendan Fallon.
And I'm Lee Smith.
And we're over the target.